A millionaire gives $500 to a beggar, but the next day he finds her crying at the grave of her lover, who had tragically died years ago. Jacob Ortega woke up, as usual, in his luxurious penthouse in the city center. The sun shone through the large windows, illuminating the marble and glass surfaces that decorated his home. Everything was perfect, at least to anyone who might look from the outside. However, for Jacob, luxury meant nothing. He had reached the pinnacle of his career, but the price he had paid for it weighed on him more and more. Over the years, his life had become a relentless routine of business meetings, million-dollar contracts, and social obligations. Numbers were his only companions, figures his only comfort. Yet, behind the facade of success, he felt empty, as though he were chasing a shadow that he could never catch. His thoughts often returned to Diego, the man who had been his best friend in college, his brother, someone with whom he had shared dreams and aspirations. When Diego was alive, Jacob believed life had purpose. The two of them argued about how they would change the world, fight injustices, and rise against the system they believed oppressed the weak. But that was before life had separated them. Jacob turned away from those ideals, seeking success at any cost. Diego, on the other hand, followed his own path, although much humbler and quieter than Jacob had imagined. Diego didn't become the great activist Jacob thought he would. After college, he worked as a gardener, a modest job that allowed him to support his family. Every day he fought to ensure his mother and siblings' well-being, while the ideals of justice still burned in his heart, even though the resources to fight the great injustices were never enough. Yet, there was something else that drove him: life, family, and the hope that someday things would change. One night, while Jacob was absorbed in his world of meetings and strategies, Diego's fate tragically changed. He was killed during an armed robbery in the neighborhood where he lived. He was coming home after a long day of work when two men intercepted him on the street. They didn't ask for much, just the money he was carrying, but Diego, with his sense of justice and need to protect what little he had, tried to resist. Terrified, the thieves shot him without hesitation. The news of Diego's murder hit Jacob like an unexpected blow. At first he thought it was an accident, something isolated. But when he saw his friend's image on the news, his heart stopped. He couldn't believe it. Diego, his friend, had died in such a trivial way as a robbery, and he hadn't been there to help him, to protect him. Jacob was filled with anger, rage, but also an anguish he had never felt before. The guilt consumed him completely. He thought about the times Diego had asked for help, about the times he had spoken about his financial struggles, but Jacob had never truly listened. He had distanced himself, ignoring Diego's suffering while he immersed himself in his own success. At the funeral, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he was facing a paradox. Diego, the most noble man he had ever known, had been taken by a cruel and unjust fate. During the ceremony, Jacob remembered the long conversations he had had with him in college, when Diego spoke about the importance of fighting for the weak, about how he had given up his own dreams to help his family. He had left all that behind for his own ambition. And now, with Diego's death, he felt that nothing could fix it. Diego, who had always been willing to give everything for others, had been the one who needed help the most, and Jacob hadn't been there when he was needed. After the funeral, Jacob returned to his home, but he could no longer enjoy the luxuries he had built. Although his professional success remained intact, he felt nothing for it. His life had become empty, like an empty stage missing its lead character. For weeks, he locked himself in his office, distancing himself from everyone, unable to stop thinking about Diego's last words, about the memories of those days when they shared dreams together. What would have happened if Diego had the support he needed? What would have happened if Jacob had listened more to his friend, if he hadn't focused solely on business and given more of himself to his friend? Jacob tried to drown these thoughts in work, but guilt tormented him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Diego's face, remembering his struggles and their endless conversations about justice, the world, and lost opportunities. There was no escaping it. What had started as a life of material success now felt like a prison built with sacrifices he didn't even understand. One day, after a series of demotivating meetings, Jacob felt he could no longer stay locked between four walls. He needed fresh air, though his mind remained trapped between guilt and regret. He decided to take a walk in a nearby park, one he used to visit with Diego during their college years. It was one of those places that, despite the fast pace of life and painful memories, gave him some calm. He walked aimlessly, feeling the wind brush his face, but unable to disconnect from what tormented him. During his walk, the image of Diego continued to haunt him. People walked by, couples laughing, children playing, but Jacob couldn't escape the feeling that he wasn't where he truly wanted to be. Life had gone on, and he had been left behind. Then he heard a sad melody, a tune that stopped him in his tracks. The music, like an echo from his past, surrounded him and made him turn back. The melody felt strangely familiar, as though it was speaking directly to his heart. He followed it until he found a young woman with a battered violin in her hands. She played with her eyes closed, as though completely lost in the music, yet she seemed disconnected from the world around her. The sound of the music moved him deeply. Somehow that melody reminded him of Diego, their conversations, and the way Diego used to play to free his soul. Without thinking, Jacob approached and handed her $500, an amount that seemed utterly insignificant in that moment compared to what he was losing inside. The woman looked at him with a grateful but distant expression, and without saying a word, she nodded. That night, after returning to his apartment, Jacob couldn't stop thinking about the young violinist, or the melody that had accompanied her. But what disturbed him most was the feeling that he had found something he had been searching for without even knowing it, a glimpse of the life he had left behind, a call to connect with something beyond success and appearances. Before going to sleep, Jacob sat by the window, looking at the lights of the city. He couldn't help but think of Diego, how his life had been cut short by violence and injustice. He thought about Diego's sacrifices, how he had given everything for his family, and how he himself had lived his life with blinded ambition without giving the value it deserved to what truly mattered. As he watched the city shine in the darkness, he felt alone, despite being surrounded by everything he once thought would bring him happiness. And there, in his solitude, Jacob understood something that changed him forever. Life wasn't just about what one achieves through effort, but also about what one leaves behind. The absence of Diego, his friend, his brother, weighed on him more than he had ever wanted to admit. But now, there was no turning back. Jacob woke up that morning with the feeling that something inside him had changed. He didn't understand what it was, but the persistent emptiness that had accompanied him for the last few years now mixed with a strange unease. The image of the young violinist continued to haunt his mind, the sad music she played, her lost gaze, almost disconnected from the world. That melody had left a deep mark on him, and although he tried to continue with his life, he couldn't help but think about it. After months of avoiding reflection, that brief encounter in the park with Andrea had opened a door that Jacob didn't know if he wanted to cross. Why had this woman affected him so much? She was just a stranger, one more among the millions of people he crossed paths with every day. And yet, the music she played and the inexplicable connection he felt to her pushed him to wonder if there was more to it than just an act of charity when he gave her the $500. That afternoon, after a morning full of more empty meetings, Jacob decided to leave the office. He didn't have a specific reason other than the need to escape the noise and the endless figures that surrounded him. He headed once again to the park where he had found Andrea, almost subconsciously, hoping to reconnect with what he had felt when he listened to her. The park was the same. The sun began to hide behind the trees, casting long shadows over the grass. People strolled leisurely, some elderly couples, children running, and a few loners like him. But for Jacob, the park was no longer the refuge he remembered from his youth. He couldn't shake the feeling that, just like his life, everything in it seemed to have changed. The world kept moving forward, but he was stuck. Jacob walked through the park aimlessly, hoping to see, even by chance, the woman who had played that moving melody. After a few minutes, he stopped at one of the benches and stared at the path, waiting for the young woman to appear. He didn't fully understand why he was doing this, but he felt his heart pulling him in that direction, as though something inside him needed an answer. Then he heard it. The melody, the same one, the same sadness, in the violin strings, the same music that, without meaning to, had dragged him into the past. He turned, and there she was, playing again with her eyes closed, as if nothing else in the world mattered. Her clothes were still the same, worn and dirty, but the music she played, was like a vibration that cut through the air and made him feel something he couldn't describe. For a moment, Jacob stood frozen. Why hadn't he forgotten about this woman? Why did he keep thinking about her, as if she were the answer to something he had lost in his life? Even though he didn't know her, though her life seemed so distant from his, there was something in her presence, in her music, that connected him to his own pain, to the guilt that consumed him over Diego's death. He approached slowly, not knowing what to do. Andrea didn't notice him coming. She was absorbed in the melody, as if her violin was the only thing keeping her connected to the world. When he reached her, the young woman looked up, and their eyes met. There was something in her gaze that unsettled him. It wasn't surprise, nor fear, nor even curiosity. It was an empty look, but also one that was determined, as if she had seen everything there was to see, and there was no space left for more. Andrea gave him a slight smile, but didn't say a word. Jacob didn't know how to start the conversation. He didn't know what he expected to get from her, or why he felt the need to speak to her. He stood there, in silence, for a long moment. Finally, it was Andrea who broke the silence. "Thank you for the money," she said softly, but her voice was filled with a sadness that seemed beyond the situation at that moment. "I didn't expect it." Jacob, surprised by her words, felt confused. She was not just a young woman on the street begging for charity. There was something in the way she spoke, in her tone, that made him feel as if he had touched something deeply human. "No, it was nothing," Jacob replied, uncomfortable with the situation. But he couldn't help feeling guilty for giving her that money without understanding the pain she carried inside. Andrea nodded slowly and continued playing without stopping. The melody filled the air again, and for a moment Jacob found himself trapped in the music, as if it were the only way to connect with something real. After a while, Andrea paused and, with a disarming calmness, said, "Would you like to sit? I don't know if you'll like what I play, but it's always easier to play when someone listens." Jacob, surprised by the invitation, sat on the bench next to her. He didn't know if it was the right thing to do, if he was crossing a line he shouldn't, but something pushed him to move forward. The young violinist began to play again, but this time her music had a different quality. It wasn't just sad. It conveyed raw, heartbreaking emotion, as if each note was a piece of her own soul being freed into the air. Jacob closed his eyes as he listened. It wasn't the music of a professional musician, but there was something so authentic about it, something so genuine, that it made him feel as though his own heart was playing. The rage, the guilt, the regret, everything seemed to blend together in that melody. He didn't know if it was his own sadness connecting him to her, or if the young violinist was speaking directly to his broken soul. When Andrea finished, Jacob looked at her. For the first time in weeks, he felt something shift inside him. The young woman, still looking straight ahead, spoke without expecting a response. "Don't worry about me. I don't expect anything from people. I just play because it's the only thing I have left." Jacob didn't know what to say. What could he say to someone who had lived so much pain in silence? What could he say when his own life felt so empty? He thought about Diego, about his death, about how he had ignored the signs that his friend needed help. He thought about everything he had left behind, everything he had failed at. "What hurts you, Andrea?" he asked, before realizing what he was saying. Andrea didn't respond immediately. She took a deep breath, as if searching for the right words, and finally said, "People like me don't have time for dreams. We just survive. What hurts you is what you couldn't save, right?" Jacob fell silent, looking at the young woman. It was as if her words pierced his chest, as if each one unearthed a part of his own pain. Eventually, Andrea stood up, and without another word, began walking toward the exit of the park. Jacob watched her for a moment, feeling a strange sense that something had begun between them, something he wasn't sure he wanted to understand. The young woman said goodbye without looking back, and when she disappeared into the shadows of the trees, Jacob remained there, motionless, with the feeling that something in his life was about to change. Something inside him had been activated, but he didn't know if it was regret, the need for redemption, or simply a search for something more than his own success. He stayed a little longer in the park, not knowing what to do with the mixed feelings crowding his chest. Everything he had built in his life now seemed insignificant, and for the first time in a long time, he realized that the pursuit of power and money no longer had any value. He needed to find something else, something real, something that connected him to what he had lost. But for now, he could only continue searching. The restlessness continued to fill Jacob's mind, a feeling he couldn't shake. Andrea's face and her music, the way her violin had spoken to him beyond words, haunted him. After weeks of immersing himself in his world of business and apparent success, he couldn't stop thinking about her. And above all, he couldn't stop thinking about the deep sadness of the melody she had played. That afternoon, as if something were guiding him without explanation, Jacob decided to leave the confinement of his office again. The city seemed unchanged, as always, with the same rush of buses and the bustle of the streets, but he, on the inside, could no longer continue as if nothing had changed. He thought about the young violinist, about the serious look on her face while she played in the park. Something about her had caught his attention, not just because of her situation, but because of the way her music expressed such pure, heartbreaking sadness, leaving a mark that he still couldn't understand. When he arrived at the park, the fresh air and stillness enveloped him. Although life continued around him, at that moment, Jacob didn't want to be part of the daily routine. He sat on one of the benches, staring at the trees, which seemed to be the only things that remained immune to the passage of time. It wasn't long before something surprised him. Andrea appeared with a bag in her hand, walking toward the same area where he had seen her before. Her figure was instantly recognizable, but what caught his attention was what she was carrying: a new violin case, clearly expensive, and a bouquet of flowers. The young woman walked to Diego's grave without even looking at him, as if her fate had already been sealed. Andrea, noticing that Jacob was watching her, showed no surprise. There was something in her demeanor that seemed to tell him that all of this was already part of her routine. She stopped in front of Diego's grave, staring at the name etched in the stone with an intensity Jacob had never seen. She placed the violin case and flowers on the ground and knelt before the tomb. Without saying a word, she began to play. The sound of the violin, though still out of tune at first, began to fill with emotion. Andrea played with such dedication, as if every note that came from the violin was dedicated to Diego, a way of paying tribute to him. Every chord seemed to express the pain that couldn't be put into words. Each vibration of the strings was a sigh laden with suffering. Jacob, moved by the scene, approached slowly. He didn't want to interrupt the intimate ceremony, but the impulse to understand the truth led him to walk toward her. When he arrived, he remained silent, observing. As Andrea played, her tears began to fall, and Jacob could see that she wasn't just crying for Diego's loss, but for everything that had been her life. The flowers, now forgotten on the ground, and the violin, now fully tuned, were not just objects. They were symbols of what Andrea had had to sacrifice, of what Diego had lost in his final act of struggle. Finally, after a long time, Andrea stopped. The notes of the violin lingered in the air, and the sound of the city, which had once seemed distant, faded away. The young woman sobbed, her face covered by her hands, as if she had released all the pain she had kept inside for so long. Jacob, standing beside her, felt how the sadness of that moment passed through him, a pain so deep and palpable that he couldn't help but feel like a participant. Andrea, without lifting her head, murmured through sobs, "I promised you, Diego. I would play for you again. I promised." Jacob couldn't help but feel moved. The scene made him feel a mix of guilt and compassion. Somehow, he had underestimated Andrea, thinking of her as just a beggar playing on the street. Now he understood that her pain was greater than he had imagined. The story of the young violinist was not just one of struggle to survive, but also one of sacrifices, of dreams shattered by the harsh reality of life. With Andrea's music resonating in his ears, Jacob sat in silence beside her. Several minutes passed before he dared to speak, but what finally came out of his mouth was a question he couldn't avoid. "Why didn't you tell me this before? Why all this?" Andrea, still with her head down, remained silent for a moment. Finally, with a broken voice, she replied, "The $500, she said, looking at the new violin she was now holding. "With that, I was able to buy a decent violin. The old one was useless. And the flowers, they're for him. It's been a long time since I brought him flowers." Jacob swallowed, hard, the lump in his throat. He realized that Andrea hadn't just used the money for herself. She had invested it in something that might have meant an opportunity to move forward, something that would allow her to keep playing, to continue the struggle for what Diego had represented. The young woman hadn't just bought a violin, she had bought a second chance for herself, and in some way, to honor Diego's memory. Jacob couldn't contain the need to understand more. Throughout his life, he had learned about people, businesses, numbers, but he had never delved so deeply into a human life as he had with Andrea. What had made her the woman she was now? What secrets did she hide? He knew that, like Diego, Andrea carried a burden that wasn't visible on the surface, a burden that deserved to be heard. He decided to investigate, not only because he wanted to understand her better, but also because deep down he felt that by doing so he could redeem himself from his own mistakes, the ones that had distanced him from Diego and from the fight Diego had wanted to lead. He started digging into Andrea's past. There was something in her story that didn't fit. The pieces he found were fragmented. She worked as a gardener, had a family, but had been living on the streets for years. The friends she had once had abandoned her, and society seemed to have forgotten her completely, leaving her alone with her violin, playing songs in the park for anyone willing to listen. He discovered that, before the tragedy that had led her to homelessness, Andrea had been a promising violinist, accepted into several music schools. However, adversities, personal traumas, and a series of bad decisions had caused her to lose everything. Her family fell apart when her mother became seriously ill and couldn't afford medical treatment. From that moment, Andrea had started playing on the streets, surviving with the hope that one day she would be able to get her life back. Jacob wasn't sure what to do with all the information he had discovered. His curiosity about Andrea had not been just an impulse, but a need to find something that would reconnect him to the humanity he had lost. But seeing the magnitude of Andrea's story, he felt that his own suffering and Diego's intertwined with hers. Something inside him began to shift. He realized he could no longer ignore the pain he had lived through. His life, so full of material achievements, had been nothing compared to the struggles of people like Andrea. And as he looked at the flowers on Diego's grave, he understood that, in his attempt to escape his own pain, he had left behind what truly mattered. "I lost him too, you know," he said, with deep sadness, as if opening up completely to her. Not just Diego, but the chance to have lived a different life, the life he dreamed of. I let myself be dragged by the pain. I let everything crush me. And when he died, everything fell apart. There was no more music, no more hope. Only the emptiness remained. Jacob, standing beside her, looked at her in silence. For a moment, he felt that his own mistakes were small compared to what Andrea had lived through. The fact that she had survived, despite everything, showed him something he had never fully understood. Strength doesn't always come from success, but from the ability to keep going in spite of suffering. Andrea took a step back, as if she needed a moment to process what she had just shared. Jacob felt that, by being there, he was somehow allowing her to enter a world he had never known, one filled with pain, sacrifice, and survival. Andrea, for her part, didn't seem to expect a response. She just needed to be heard, as if she needed to release everything she had kept inside for so long. Finally, Jacob dared to break the silence. "What happened to Diego after college?" he asked, his voice deep, as if the conversation had touched something inside him that needed understanding. "Why did he end up working as a gardener?" Andrea, surprised by the question, looked at him for a moment, as if evaluating whether to tell him the truth. Finally, she took a deep breath and began to speak. After college, Diego dedicated himself to his family. His mother was ill, and his siblings needed his support. He didn't have many options. He thought the best way to take care of them was to get a steady job, even if it wasn't what he had dreamed of. But he never stopped fighting. Every time his day ended as a gardener, he stayed late looking for ways to help others. Sometimes he'd tell me about the things he had discovered, the injustices he saw, and he'd say that one day he would do something about it. But he never had the chance. Jacob listened attentively, feeling an increasing sense of helplessness. Diego's life hadn't been easy, but through his eyes, Jacob understood something more. Diego, the man he had known, who had been his friend, wasn't just seeking justice for himself, but for others. And he, Jacob, had been too focused on his own world to see it. Andrea paused, her voice breaking as she recalled Diego's last days. Her story was one of many, people trying to survive in a world that gave them no space. But it was also the story of a man who never stopped fighting, even when everything seemed to be against him. The young violinist, her life marked by pain and tragedy, had witnessed all of it. "I couldn't save him," Andrea said, her voice broken with emotion. "But I try every day. I try to keep going because he showed me what it meant to live with purpose. And even though I lost him, he will always be my inspiration." Jacob, overwhelmed by Andrea's words, understood that it was time to face what he had left behind. He could no longer justify his life, his success, without considering the lessons of those who had fought for something greater than themselves. Diego, Andrea, their sacrifice. Everything was telling him what he had ignored for so long. He remained silent, looking at Diego's grave, but also at Andrea, who offered him the only truth she had been able to see. Shared suffering isn't always something that can be fixed, but it's something that can redirect the path of those willing to learn from it. The wind began to rise, and the shadows of the day lengthened over the cemetery. Jacob knew something had changed. He couldn't go back, but for the first time, he felt that perhaps he could still do something that had real meaning. After their encounter at the cemetery, Jacob couldn't stop thinking about Andrea. The words she had entrusted him about her life, Diego's sacrifice, and the suffering she carried had hit him deeply. There was something in her pain, something so genuine and heartbreaking that it touched a part of him that had been dormant for years. As he immersed himself in analyzing his own life, he realized how empty his existence had become despite everything he had achieved. In that very instant, Andrea's figure became a reflection of everything he had lost by prioritizing success and superficiality over what truly mattered: human connections, love, and compassion. The encounter with Andrea had awakened in him a need for redemption, to try to fill the emptiness he felt inside. The fact that she was so alone, so broken, evoked a deep compassion in him. He wanted to help her, not only because he owed something to Diego, but because he felt that somehow Andrea could be the vehicle for him to find something more in life, something that would give it meaning. In the days that followed, Jacob began to get closer to Andrea. He knew she had suffered greatly, and he thought that what she needed most was help, a tangible support to take her out of the poverty and pain that had marked her. In his mind, the solution seemed simple. If he could give her a better life, if he could ease her suffering with material things, maybe, in some way, he could also ease his own. He started with small gestures. He offered her money, a generous sum that, in his mind, would solve many of her problems. He saw her a couple of times in the park, playing her violin with the same sadness in her eyes, and on those occasions he would approach and give her some bills. He thought that by giving her money, he would relieve her burden, helping her to leave the street. But his gestures didn't seem to make any impact on her. One day, he decided to go further. He invited her to his apartment, a place he considered the symbol of his success. He offered her a comfortable space to stay, even gave her new clothes and better quality violins. He wanted to fill her emptiness with what he knew best, the power of wealth, the power of material things. What you lack is comfort, he thought. If I could offer you what you desire most, your life would change, and maybe you would change too. But what he expected to be a gesture of gratitude turned into a palpable silence. Andrea, at first, accepted everything with a distant kindness. However, as time passed, Jacob realized she didn't react the way he had expected. Her indifference unsettled him. Even though she accepted his gifts, she showed no emotion. There was no thankfulness, no spark of hope in her eyes. One day, confused by her distant attitude, Jacob decided to confront her. He was convinced that if he could prove to her that he could offer her a better life, he would somehow help her heal. He invited her to dinner at his apartment, prepared with everything he thought she would like: gourmet food, expensive wine, a comfortable setting. But when she arrived, Andrea didn't seem impressed. She sat at the table, looking at the food with indifference, as if everything was as unimportant as the place where she had spent the last years of her life. "Would you like to eat something?" Jacob asked, with a tense smile. Andrea looked up and stared at him. She didn't say anything at first. Then, in a quiet voice, she simply replied, "I don't need you to offer me any of this, Jacob. I don't need you to spend your money on me." Andrea's words hurt him more than he expected. She didn't say it in a hostile way, but the indifference with which she uttered each sentence disarmed him. At that moment, Jacob realized what he had never understood. It wasn't money, nor material things that could fill Andrea's emptiness. Her pain, her suffering, were deeper than anything he could offer her. That night, after dinner, they sat in the living room of his apartment, in silence. Jacob felt that something was breaking inside him, that the barrier between him and Andrea was growing larger with every failed attempt to help her. In his effort to ease Andrea's suffering, he had come up against an emotional wall he couldn't break through. And more than anything, he realized that this wall wasn't built by Andrea's indifference, but by his own inability to see beyond the superficial. He had been so obsessed with his success and what he could offer that he had forgotten the most important thing. Suffering isn't always healed with material things. Andrea, seeing Jacob's expression, sighed and finally broke the silence. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, Jacob, but you can't fill what can't be fixed. It's not about what you give me, nor how luxurious the life you offer is. I can't erase what I've lived through. I can't erase what Diego lost, what I lost. It's not about having things. It's about surviving. And there are wounds that won't heal, even if you offer the entire world. But thank you so much. I really appreciate what you're doing for me." Jacob looked at her, feeling her words pierce his chest. The truth Andrea had told him hurt more than he could have imagined. Everything he had tried to do to fill Andrea's emptiness, everything he had thought could solve the situation, was wrong. It wasn't the material things that would heal her, but the recognition of the pain she carried with her, the suffering that had been her life. As the days passed, Jacob began to realize that no matter how much he tried, he couldn't fill Andrea's emptiness. Despite his efforts to offer her a better life, the young violinist remained the same, marked by pain and constant struggle. Andrea accepted his gestures, but never changed. She always remained distant, as if something inside her had died a long time ago and couldn't be resurrected. The truth began to make its way into Jacob's mind. He couldn't help her in the way he thought. Material things couldn't fix what had happened. They couldn't erase the deep scar that marked Andrea's life. And without realizing it, Jacob began to understand that he couldn't fill the emptiness of his own life with what he had done up to that point. His possessions, his success, were not the answer. In his desire to help her, he had forgotten the most essential thing: genuine connection, the need to understand, to listen, without expecting anything in return. Andrea didn't want his money. She didn't want a luxurious life. She just needed to be heard, understood, loved, even in her pain. That night, after another failed attempt at conversation, Andrea stood up and, without saying a word, left his apartment. Jacob watched her from the window, seeing her walk down the empty street until she disappeared into the darkness. In his mind, something had changed, something that he couldn't undo. But for the first time, he realized that what he had tried to give Andrea couldn't fill her. And maybe that same emptiness inside her was the same one he carried with him, the same emptiness he couldn't fill with more things, more accomplishments, or material wealth. Jacob closed his eyes and lay back on the sofa, alone, facing the cold truth. His life of success and material wealth had been empty, and now, in trying to save Andrea, he realized that pain, loss, and the struggle to find meaning in the midst of chaos were things that couldn't be fixed with gifts, money, or a perfect facade. The real lesson was a much harder one. Healing begins when one faces the pain, and only when one is willing to accept it and share it without expecting anything in return. Jacob woke up the next morning with the feeling that he had failed. The emotional distance between him and Andrea, which seemed unbreakable, had left him submerged in a mixture of frustration and despair. Despite everything he had tried, the young violinist didn't seem interested in changing her life. Every attempt to offer her something material had been rejected or simply accepted with distant indifference. Andrea remained trapped in her own pain, and the suffering she had been carrying for so long kept her away from any genuine attempt at connection. But something inside Jacob kept pushing him. He couldn't let her go. He couldn't resign himself to the idea that everything he tried to do for her would be in vain. She had lost Diego, just like he had. They both shared a deep pain, though in different ways. But while he had found a way to escape through success and superficiality, Andrea seemed to have become trapped in a darkness from which she couldn't escape. It was on one of those nights, when Jacob was reviewing company papers, trying to distract himself from his thoughts, that an idea came to him. If money and material things hadn't worked, maybe something else could help her. He thought of something he had never considered before: therapy. Although he didn't believe in psychology or therapy sessions, something inside him told him that if Andrea could face her pain with someone trained to help her, maybe things would change. Diego's death, her suffering, her inability to overcome the loss. All of that was too much for one person to bear alone. Determined to help her, Jacob contacted a psychologist who specialized in trauma and depression. He was a well-known therapist in the city, someone with experience working with people dealing with significant losses. He briefly explained Andrea's situation, her life marked by pain and tragedy, and his desire to give her the opportunity to overcome Diego's death, though he didn't know if it would be enough. The psychologist accepted the case, and Jacob, feeling satisfied that he had made a decision, thought that he was finally doing something truly useful for Andrea. The session was scheduled for the next day. When the day came, Andrea didn't seem particularly enthusiastic about the idea. Jacob's invitation had surprised her, and she couldn't help but look at him skeptically. Although, at first, she said nothing, her indifferent attitude made him doubt whether he could really do anything that would make a difference. But Jacob insisted, arguing that it was an opportunity for her, a necessary step for her to heal and move forward. After a long silence, Andrea agreed to see the psychologist, not because she wanted to, but rather because, in her broken heart, there was still a spark of hope to find a way to alleviate the internal storm that consumed her. The first session was difficult for both of them. Andrea, as Jacob had feared, wasn't willing to open up easily. The psychologist, a middle-aged man with a calm, professional gaze, tried to get her to talk about Diego's loss, about how that death had marked her life. But Andrea remained distant, almost frozen in her responses. Her empty gaze, her closed body language, all indicated that she couldn't, or didn't want to, face what she had lost. Every time she was asked to speak about Diego, her response was the same, a deep silence that spoke volumes. The psychologist didn't give up. He continued to guide her with gentle questions, but Andrea remained in her own world, disconnected from reality. Every attempt to touch her pain was in vain. She remained in her state of apathy, disconnected from anything other than the memory of her lost love. After several sessions, the result was the same. Andrea was becoming more and more reluctant to talk. Despite the psychologist's efforts, who tried to find alternative ways to reach her, Andrea's depression was too deep, too rooted. The pain from Diego's loss had sunk her into a despair that couldn't be addressed with simple words. Jacob, seeing how Andrea shut herself off more and more, began to wonder if there was really anything he could do. One day, after another session that ended in silence, the psychologist approached Jacob with a serious, almost grim expression. "Andrea is in a very dark place," he said bluntly. "Diego's loss has left her deeply marked. She is dealing with severe depression, and what I see is that, beyond the sessions, what she really needs is time. It's not something that can be fixed in a few weeks." Jacob looked at him, feeling a pressure in his chest. He knew there was something behind his words that he couldn't ignore. "What does that mean?" he asked, almost desperately. "It means that, although therapy can help, Andrea's pain is so deep that she's not ready to face it. It's not just about her talking or receiving treatment, Jacob. It's about accepting what she has lost. And until she allows herself to go through that process on her own, there's not much we can do." Leaving the session, Jacob sat in his car, looking at the city through the fogged windshield. His hands on the steering wheel trembled slightly. He had done everything he could. He had paid for the best therapist, tried to offer her everything he thought might help, but all of that had been for nothing. Andrea was still the same, distant, lost in her pain. The psychologist had given him a definitive answer, an answer that Jacob didn't want to hear, but had become inevitable. He couldn't help her, at least not in the way he thought. Andrea didn't need objects or therapy or money. What she really needed was something much deeper, something Jacob couldn't give her, nor the psychologist, nor anyone else. The need to heal, to forgive herself, and to find peace was something only Andrea could achieve. And no matter how much Jacob wanted to intervene, he couldn't fill that void with more material things or more good intentions. That night, after the failed session, Andrea stopped responding to Jacob's messages. Although he insisted for days, she never showed up. His calls were ignored, and soon he realized that the distance between them was even greater than before. Andrea wasn't ready to leave her pain behind, and no matter how much Jacob tried to help her, she couldn't be forced to heal. Andrea's depression had been an invisible but very real wall, one that neither money, professional help, nor Jacob's emotional support could break through. In the stillness of his office, Jacob finally accepted what he had been avoiding. Andrea's life, marked by a tragedy that he would never fully understand, couldn't be fixed with external gestures. The truth hit him with overwhelming intensity. He couldn't save her. And although he still worried about her, the feeling of helplessness consumed him. The only way for Andrea to heal was to go through her own process of pain and suffering. And that, Jacob understood, was something he couldn't decide or control. Andrea's story had touched him deeply, but the struggle to save her, though sincere, had been a futile effort. It wasn't about how much he could offer, but how much she could truly accept. And that was a lesson that was hard to learn. As he sat back in his chair, looking at the horizon from his office, Jacob couldn't help but wonder if, in some way, everything he had done for Andrea had been nothing more than a way to redeem his own mistakes. He knew he couldn't change his past, nor hers. All that remained was the acceptance that sometimes there are battles we can't win. The sound of the phone broke the silence of the morning in Jacob's penthouse. At this hour, he would usually be immersed in the company's financial reports, reviewing numbers, analyzing contracts. The routine that had always kept him detached from his emotions had turned him into a practical, almost insensitive man. But in that moment, the phone rang differently. His intuition told him something was wrong. It was an unknown number. Jacob hesitated for a moment, but in the end, he answered. "Jacob Ortega," said a voice on the other end. It was a man's voice, deep and serious. "I'm Commissioner Smith from the police. I'm calling to inform you about something related to Andrea." Jacob's stomach twisted upon hearing Andrea's name. For days, he had been trying to give her space, respecting her pain, but he had felt an emptiness in his life since he stopped seeing her. Despite everything, he had never stopped worrying about her. The commissioner continued speaking, but his words began to blur. "Unfortunately, Andrea was found dead this morning." The commissioner's voice faltered. "It has been confirmed as a suicide." Jacob felt the air escape from his lungs. The phone began to slip from his hand, but he managed to hold on to it. His mind couldn't process what he had just heard. Andrea, the woman with whom he had shared so many moments, although brief, the woman whose sadness had touched the deepest part of his soul, had taken her life. The commissioner explained that Andrea had been found in her apartment with a pill overdose. She hadn't left a note, just a palpable trace of desperation in her small space, as if she had fought to find a way out that never came. The news hit Jacob like a hammer blow. He couldn't believe it. Although he knew Andrea had been deeply affected by Diego's death, he never thought the suffering would drive her to this extreme. His mind couldn't process everything, but something inside him told him that, despite all he had tried, he hadn't been able to save her. Hours after receiving the news, Jacob still couldn't stop thinking about the image of Andrea at her grave, playing her violin. The melody of her music, so full of both pain and hope, echoed in his mind, like an echo that would never fade. Guilt engulfed him immediately. He wondered if he had done something differently, if his insistence on offering her material things, instead of being more direct with his emotional support, could have made a difference. Could he have been there for her in a more effective way? Could he have saved her? He sat at his desk in his office, looking at the panoramic view of the city. The same city that had always been his refuge, his place of power. But at that moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had achieved, everything he had built, was empty. None of it mattered. Andrea was gone, and with her went a part of him he had never truly known, the Jacob who could still feel, who could still connect with the suffering of another human being. Jacob spent the next hours pacing around his apartment, unable to focus on anything. Every corner seemed to remind him of what he had lost. The masterpiece he had created over the years, the business empire, was now worthless. Money and material things couldn't bring Andrea back, nor Diego. He had tried to fill his own void with everything he thought would work, but all of it was just a facade. It wasn't about what one owned, but how one shared their life, how one dealt with the pain of others. In the stillness of his pain, Jacob realized something crucial. His life had been a constant escape from sadness, from suffering. He hadn't wanted to face what he truly felt: work, money, the perfect image of his life. Everything had been a way to avoid the discomfort of suffering. But now, in facing Andrea's loss and realizing he had tried to save her in superficial ways, something inside him shattered. There were no easy answers to this kind of suffering. That night, as he gazed at the emptiness of his living room, Jacob felt the weight of guilt and pain too heavy to bear on his own. Andrea, with her life broken by tragedy, had been trapped in her pain, unable to find peace. And he, with all his power and resources, had failed by not understanding what she truly needed. Someone to listen to her, someone to understand her, someone to guide her through her own suffering. The frustration led him to a breaking point. He could no longer ignore the fact that, like Andrea, he too was suffering. Although he had distanced himself from that pain, he had suppressed it for so long that now it was overflowing. He decided to take the step he never thought he would, to go to therapy. Not because he believed he would find all the answers immediately, but because somehow he understood he had reached the limit of what he could handle on his own. Andrea's death had been the final push. He could no longer ignore his own pain, nor his own wrong decisions. The next morning, Jacob called the psychologist he had spoken to before for Andrea. His voice sounded lower than usual when he asked for an appointment for himself. He needed help. He needed to understand why he had been so disconnected from what really mattered. He needed to know how to face suffering, how to learn to live with the pain and guilt that had been eating away at him. The psychologist accepted the appointment, and although Jacob knew he wouldn't find quick solutions, something inside him told him this was the first step toward realizing that life wasn't just about professional success or making more money, but about connecting with others, learning to live with the deepest human emotions: suffering, regret, and compassion. In the following weeks, Jacob began attending his therapy sessions. Each session was a confrontation with himself, an opportunity to unravel the layers of his life and decisions. It wasn't easy. Every word the psychologist said pushed him to look more closely at the shadows he had kept away for so long. But little by little, he began to realize that the healing process wasn't quick or easy. It was a long and painful road that could only be walked by facing himself. Although Jacob didn't have all the answers, something had begun to change within him. He had accepted that suffering couldn't be avoided or solved with material things or power. The real struggle was internal. And just like Andrea, he too had to learn to face his own demons. He couldn't keep running away. He had lost Andrea, but her death had led him to a deep awakening, a recognition of what truly mattered. As he took small step after small step in his therapy, Jacob also began to understand the lesson he had never learned. Love, compassion, emotional support are the only things that truly remain. And although he couldn't save Andrea, her death had taught him something valuable: the need to heal, to connect, and to stop running from pain. And somewhere, through all the suffering and loss, Jacob began to glimpse the possibility of a new beginning. Time had passed, and with it, a deep transformation had taken place in Jacob. He was no longer the man he had been before Andrea's death, nor the one who had tried to fill his emptiness with superficial achievements and material things. The serenity he had found in his life after all the suffering was a quiet peace, as if he had finally learned to reconcile with his own ghosts. Although the pain of losing Andrea and Diego still lingered, it no longer defined him. Now he felt his life had a clearer purpose. It wasn't about escaping sadness, but about living with it, learning to accept suffering as part of the human journey. However, a sense of nostalgia and melancholy still accompanied him. Looking back at those moments with Andrea, at his failed attempts to save her, he didn't just feel guilt, but a deeper sadness, the understanding that some wounds can't be healed no matter how hard we try. But at the same time, there was something that had eased in his heart. The connection to his own pain, the acceptance of what he had lost, had helped him open a new door to life. Today, Jacob found himself once again standing in front of the mirror, looking at himself, not as the man he had been before, but as the man he had learned to be, with a mixture of solemnity and strange peace. The time had come to fulfill his final purpose, one that had been in his mind since he had lost Andrea, to give her a final rest, a symbolic closure to the life she could never finish. The desire to take Andrea to be beside Diego, to finally unite them in that place of rest, was something he felt deeply in his heart, something he needed to do to heal and let go. Although he knew Andrea could never return, the thought of her resting beside Diego was an act of redemption, not just for her, but also for him. Andrea had lost so much in life, and although nothing he did could bring her back, what he could offer her now was a final peaceful rest beside the man she had loved so much. The journey to the cemetery was silent, but deep down, Jacob felt a strange mixture of emotions. The city, from the car, seemed so distant, so indifferent to what he was living in that moment. The evening light tinted the streets with a golden hue, as if the day itself were bidding him farewell. As he drove, he thought about everything that had changed in his life. He had been through so much, had learned so much from his pain, that now he felt he was on the right path to healing. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but now he was ready to move forward. Upon arriving at the cemetery, Jacob did not feel overwhelming fear or sadness. He felt something closer to acceptance, as if this moment was the closure of a cycle that had begun with Diego's death and had extended with Andrea's. The place was calm, and the cool breeze of the late day brushed his face as he walked toward the graves. When he reached Diego's grave, he paused for a moment. He crouched down and placed the bouquet of fresh flowers he had brought with him. They were the same flowers Andrea had left on his grave months earlier, and now he brought them as a way to honor both of them. Although Diego had never lived a full life, although his fight for justice had never been completed, Jacob knew that his sacrifice had been significant. He had been a man who never stopped fighting for what he believed in, despite the difficulties. At that moment, Jacob felt that his life too should be lived with that purpose. He could no longer keep running from suffering. He could no longer seek easy answers. The real lesson was to face life as it came, with its shadows and lights, with its suffering and its joy. It was the end of an era for him, but also the beginning of something new. The violin began to play in the distance. The musician Jacob had hired, a professional violinist who had arrived at the cemetery just before him, began to play the last song that Andrea had never been able to play for Diego. The melody filled the air, soft and sad, like a farewell. The music, with its sadness and beauty, seemed to encapsulate everything Andrea had felt in her life, everything she had tried to express, but never could fully share. Jacob remained silent, watching as the music flowed. Each note felt like a sigh, a tribute to the woman who had been able to touch his soul with just a few strings. Despite all the pain caused by her death, Andrea had left a deep mark on him. He no longer felt only guilt, but a deep respect for her struggle, for her lost love. When the song ended, the violinist stopped playing, and silence filled the cemetery. Jacob approached Andrea's grave, now beside Diego's, and placed the flowers he had brought. With trembling hands, he murmured, almost in a whisper, "I promised you I would give you rest, Andrea. I hope you found the peace you deserve. And that somehow, you've received what I tried to offer you." Jacob stood up slowly, looking at the two graves now together. Something inside him told him this was the closure he needed, not only for Andrea and Diego, but also for himself. He had fulfilled his purpose. He could do no more for them or for his past, but he had found a way to reconcile with his pain and with the life he had lived up until now. Before leaving, Jacob looked at the graves once more, and for the first time in a long time, a feeling of peace filled him. He was not happy about the losses he had suffered, but he had learned to accept that life wasn't something he could always control. Suffering and joy, life and death, they were all part of the same cycle, something he had, in some way, come to understand. "I hope, in some way, This act is the last gift I can give you, and please know that I will never forget you." The violin slowly stopped playing, and the air calmed, as if the earth itself was breathing. Jacob stood up, looking at the graves for the last time, and in his heart, for the first time, he felt a peace he had never known. He couldn't bring them back, but he had done what he felt he needed to do. As he left the cemetery, with night softly falling over the city, Jacob felt that, although the pain of loss would never completely disappear, he could now move forward. He had taken a step toward healing, not just for his life, but also for the memory of Andrea and Diego. His final promise had been fulfilled, and with that, his own journey of redemption had begun. The pain of loss is something we all face at some point in our lives. It's a universal experience, though unique to each of us. The death of a loved one, whether a friend, a family member, or even a part of ourselves, hits us in ways we cannot anticipate. It drags us, changes us, leaves us empty. And no matter how hard we try to fill that emptiness with distractions or material things, there is always something that remains untouched, the need to confront and accept that pain. Loss reminds us how fragile we are, how fleeting life can be. It makes us see that the love we share with those who have gone is not something that is lost with them, but stays with us. That love lives on in our memories, in the lessons they left us, in the moments shared, even if they are now only echoes. Pain is proof that love existed, that it was worth living. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that suffering is endless, that we will never be the same after losing someone important. But suffering is not the enemy. It's the doorway to our humanity, to our ability to feel deeply, to connect with others in their fragility. By accepting pain, we don't make it bigger, but we make it more bearable. And over time, though it may never disappear completely, we learn to carry it. It helps us grow, to be more compassionate with ourselves and others. What's important, what's truly liberating, is learning to move forward with loss. We don't forget our loved ones, nor do we leave them behind. We carry their memories, their teachings, their love with us. They continue to be part of who we are, and though we cannot bring them back, we can honor them by living with everything they gave us. The pain of loss is profound, but the acceptance of that pain allows us to move forward, heal, and find, amidst the sadness, a new way to live. It's not forgetting, but a way of remembering with gratitude, with love, and with the wisdom that time gives us. If you've lost someone, if you feel like the pain is consuming you, I invite you to remember that it's okay to feel. It's okay to cry, and it's okay to take your time to heal. Healing is not a straight line, nor a race. It's a journey, with ups and downs, but always forward. And as you walk, allow yourself to feel, allow yourself to live, and above all, allow yourself to heal. Remember, love doesn't go with those who have left. It stays with us, inside of us, and it's what, eventually, allows us to find peace, even though we never forget the void they left. Thank you for watching the video. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. See you in the next one.